Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year. Welcome to the first Seeker session of 2024. I'm glad to be with you. And let's say hi to Jay Copley. How are you, Jay?
Hello, Mark. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Welcome. So, this month we are looking at the wisdom of saying no and why restraint is different from repression. We're going to be examining boundaries and why the willingness to say no is such an essential part of psychological health as well as a spiritual awakening. Now, this may seem very obvious at first. Of course, knowing when to say no is important when we're pressured to do things that we know to be wrong. Of course, boundary setting is part of being a grown up and making informed and effective choices. So, what's newsworthy about that? A well informed seeker might ask. Why focus on the wisdom of saying no and the spiritual practice of self restraint? The answer to this question has several different dimensions. First, we live in a culture where consumerism, overabundance of choice, and the ideal of more is more continues to prevail. We're encouraged to believe that material abundance and self indulgence are the path to happiness, and that the one who dies with the most toys wins. We are told to grab for all the gusto you can, as the Schlitz beer commercial used to put it, and that is the surefire path to a successful life. Now, although science has proved this to be patently untrue, our misunderstanding about more is more and the unrestrained life remains very common. When it comes to quality of life, losing yourself on the hedonic treadmill, as it's called in positive psychology, the mouse wheel of self satisfaction, is known to be the fast track to misery and disappointment. Once we've attained the basic necessities of our lives, increases in income and possessions are shown to have almost no effect on our happiness levels. And yet we strive and crave and look askance at the prospect of saying no. The notion of restraint, or God forbid, sacrifice, seem to go against our idea of flourishing. Saying no can feel like an obstacle to well being in the culture of more is more, when in fact the opposite turns out to be true. Being able to step back from our cravings in the moment of being pulled toward an unnecessary indulgence is actually a portal to freedom and self awareness. This is agreed upon by most spiritual traditions, that by renouncing craving, we empower ourselves. If we agree that the goal of spiritual practice is reduction of egocentric oppression and suffering, we can do ourselves a big favor by not succumbing to every one of our cravings, not being prisoners of our appetites or slaving away to feed the hungry ghost. When I first became interested in spiritual matters, I rejected the idea of restraint and renunciation on principle. It just seemed to me like a life denying, joy killing rules that came out of religious dogma that were meant to kind of keep our senses under control and ashamed enough to obey the rules of our chosen tradition. On the scale of ascetic to libertine, I fell well on the side of enjoying life's pleasures. I had no interest in using spiritual practice as a scold or as a buzzkill that interfered with sensuous interests or the indulgences of being alive. Neither did most of the teachers that I knew. I remember sitting down with a well known meditation master as he finished his second glass of wine and thinking, well, this is how enlightenment looks, sometimes tipsy, sometimes sober. Who was I to judge? Recently, on the last day of a week long retreat with a very well known teacher, there was a party on the last night of the retreat with alcohol served and lots of dancing and a live band. And I thought to myself as we were, having fun on the dance floor, well, this is what enlightenment looks like. This is contemporary Tantra. You sit in silent meditation for a week, absorbing philosophical teachings, getting still and quiet. And then you bring that serenity to the dance floor where people are drinking and cutting a rug, and the teacher is jumping up and down like somebody who just saw a performance of Riverdance. Self indulgence need not be anti-spiritual. Of course. I firmly believe that life is inviting a big yes from us a lot of the time. But there's a lot to be learned by saying no as well. And that's what I want to look at with you this month. At the retreat, for example, we'd had the choice of eating with other people and socializing or going to the quiet room. And I always sat in the quiet room because I needed to say no to conversation. I was there to get silent, not to chit chat with people over meals. So, on a deeper level, renunciation, a word that has an even worse reputation than sacrifice and restraint, has actually a beautiful spiritual significance that has nothing to do with punitive religious dogma or self punishment or self denial. Renunciation, in a spiritual sense, deepens our compassion for people who can't speak, for example, for those who are suffering or alone or unheard. Renunciation can keep us sensitive to the unloved, the unhoused, the unfed, those among us who are doing without, whether their renunciation was voluntary or not. Doing without can actually keep us humble and also grateful for what we do have. The word sacrifice comes from the same root as faith, and it opens us up, or can do, to the tender, vulnerable dimension of being. It can remind us that there will come a time when all of us will have to let go of all of it. When in our own lifetime we will cease to have. And that realization is actually gold on the seeker's path. We learn that pleasure seeking, as lovely as it can be, also keeps us on the surface of things very often. Superficiality helps us to avoid the undercurrent of impermanence and vulnerability that are also part of being human. And that can be a terrible waste. When I first came back from India, when I was in my early 30s, I decided that I wanted to be celibate. I decided that I wanted to give it a year just as an experiment and see what it would be like to live a life without sex. This wasn't a moralistic choice. It was more a kind of emotional readjustment and upgrade of the neurotic model that I had been operating with for most of my life at that time. While I was in India, it had become glaringly obvious to me that I had a profound confusion about the relationship between love and sex. I had grown exhausted from the drama, the repetition, as well as the lust. And I wanted to know how it might feel to put those parts of myself into alignment and to operate from a foundation of self awareness instead of always leading with my libido. What I found out was that celibacy wasn't nearly as hard as I thought it would be. In fact, it came as a kind of relief to not be constantly on the prowl, scanning the world with the eyes of desire. On a meditation retreat that I had taken years before, the teacher had recommended that we pay 90% of our attention on ourselves and 10% on the people around us. So when I took on this vow of celibacy, I applied this to my life in New York, kind of adjusting for the urban setting by putting maybe 30% of my attention outward and 70% on myself. And what I found was that moving through the world as a celibate made it possible to connect with other people in very novel ways without the armor of virility blocking the way or being confined by some kind of sexual persona. It also made me more sensitive to the loneliness of other people and the suffering generally that I came into contact with. It wasn't that I didn't feel lonely myself. I did, but it wasn't a bad kind of lonely. It was a loneliness that you feel after watching a sunset by yourself, or reading an amazing poem, or hearing a piece of music alone in the car, and realizing your own solitude in a new way, the solitude of being in your own body, and the space between yourself and others. That gave rise to an exposed and an exposing sensation. I realized during that celibate year how I'd been using sexuality as a shield against this loneliness and how good it felt not to be doing that. There were a few awkward moments here and there, and when a flirtatious urge might come up like a phantom limb. But I managed to keep my vow throughout those 12 months, and I learned a lot about how self restraint was different than repression. The punchline of this story is that when I finally did go out on a date with someone I had known before, the feedback was that I seemed to have become a much nicer person, even though I used to be hotter. Now, it's been said that we live in a culture of addiction. That society as we know it in the West is an addict, driven by its cravings, enslaved by its corporate oppressors, those profiteers who seek to keep us hooked and insatiable and hungry for more. My friend Andrew Harvey has written about this powerfully. This is what Andrew says, quote, "This culture feeds off an anxiety and depression that it carefully nurtures with a consumer machine that needs to keep us greedy to keep going. It is highly organized, versatile, and sophisticated. It assaults us from every angle with its propaganda and creates an almost impregnable environment of addiction around us. Obsessed with hopes, dreams, and ambitions which promise happiness but lead only to misery. We're like people crawling through an endless desert, dying of thirst, and all this culture holds out to us is a drink of salt water designed to make us thirstier." Unquote. We don't get to happiness by saying yes indiscriminately to every craving that arises. That's obvious. What may be less obvious is the opportunity costs of not learning to say no or discriminate between different levels of desire in our lives. When we miss out on the greater goals and intentions that we have because we can't say no to passing fancies, it's kind of like getting stuck at the salad bar of life and never having the main course. The main course, in terms of our spiritual life, is experiencing how it feels to let go. The main course is the ability to step off the treadmill and into the experience of simply being. Presence is the gift that we often miss when we're so busy chasing the next shiny thing. I saw this very clearly when I was celibate. I was a lot more present than usual with people that I met. The connection between us felt more palpable and heartfelt when half of me wasn't elsewhere, kind of pumping the muscles of my imagination. So ask yourself, are you able to feel the freedom of letting go? Or do you tend to focus on what you're missing? Are there areas of your life that are particularly spacious, less conflicted, more open, and receptive for having said no in some way or another? Someone made me laugh recently when we were talking about our busy schedules. He mentioned something called JOMO, the joy of missing out. This guy in his early 60s loves nothing more than last-minute cancellations, which allow him to stay home, put his feet up, and just do whatever he wants to do or simply stare out the window. JOMO is something to think about, the relief of not having more, the joy of not missing out. In my experience, the older you get, the less you need to make you happy. And the less willing you are to do unnecessary things that don't make you happy or spend time in ways that truly don't satisfy you. It makes you more honest, and it also makes you less popular, which is something that I've learned to live with. The truth is that everything worthwhile, beginning with our mental health, requires sacrifice. Love, work, spiritual practice, public service, you name it. To gain, we must always give up something. There is no yes to something major without any number of no's to meaningless distractions. The question is, what are you willing to give up? What might you need to give up in order to be happy? What large aspiration is worth the sacrifice of negligible things in your life that block its success? This is a very important point, and it really can't be overstated. When the inability to say no interferes with happiness and freedom, it is incumbent upon us to make a choice, to discern among the various forces in our lives and decide where our values actually are. Now, this is easier said than done, of course. We're complex, changeable, contradictory creatures. We want one thing one day, we want something else the next. But what I've found is that when you pause to quiet your mind, and you do this on a regular basis, you notice that there are things in you that don't change. There are certain values and tastes and desires and aspirations that are consistent. Certain values cohere in your being. Most of the time, these consistent values are linked to connection, to healing, and to love, but also to self-realization, creative, emotional, and spiritual, and not being inauthentic in the world, not apologizing for who we are. At the end of the day, we long to be free of the shame that helps keep us bound to craving and grabbing and consuming ravenously in order to finally feel like we're barely enough. So ask yourself, how would it feel to be free of that shame? What would it be like to no longer be driven by the gaping void, what a friend of mine in recovery calls the God-sized hole at our center that can never be filled or satisfied? These are some of the questions that we're going to be exploring this month together in our program, and I'm looking forward to that very much as we explore the wisdom of restraint and the spiritual practice of saying no. So that's what I wanted to say to you this evening. Jay, why don't we pull up the card and we'll get to it. Here we are. Okay, folks, I'd like you please now to take 20 minutes to write about where in your own life you would like to say no. Where do you need to say no in your own life? Where and when do you confuse restraint with repression? Be as specific as you can be, please. 10 minutes in, the breakout room will open. You're welcome to join a group and talk to other members about the exercise, or just keep on writing. 20 minutes.